guys, this lecture is called The Path to War, and basically what you need to be able to do when you're finished here, you need to be able to explain the series of compromises that are going to put off the Civil War as long as it is put off, okay, until basically 1861. So we've been talking since the beginning of this course that slavery is an issue that a lot of people, the founding fathers, they just didn't want to deal with it because there was no clean way to do it that was going to make everyone happy. So ultimately what we're going to look at is the compromises that keep the Union together until 1861, okay, which is ultimately where we're headed here is the Civil War. Okay, we're going to start with the Missouri Compromise. This was in 1820. We talked about this just a tiny bit in the last unit, okay? But basically what's going to happen is the nation expands. Every time a new state requests to be admitted to the Union, it is a problem because the balance between free states and slave states was so tenuous and so important. Okay, so let me give you an idea of what I'm talking about. When Missouri asks to enter the Union as a slave state in 1820, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states. If Missouri entered as a slave state, this would throw that balance off, okay? Why is that a problem, okay? Two big reasons. The big problem is the Senate, okay? That would have meant that the slave side of things would have had 2 additional votes over the free side and the ability to pass things. The other thing that we have to look at is presidential votes, okay? There was the potential there that one side could have a greater voice in electing the president in the Electoral College. There's lots of arguing back and forth, and Henry Clay is going to come up with a compromise. This is not the last time he's going to do this, okay? Here's the compromise. There's 2 major parts. First, Missouri is going to be admitted as a slave state, but to balance it out, they will also admit Maine, which is a free state. So we keep that balance the same. It's now 12 to 12. 12 free, 12 slave. Here's the second part of it. The Missouri Compromise declares slavery north of the latitude line of 3630. That area is close to slavery going forward. Okay, so here's what we're practically talking about. We are talking about all land in the Louisiana Purchase north of the southern border of Missouri is going to be close to slavery. Here you guys can see a map of exactly what I just told you about, okay? If you'll take a look at this dark black line just below that southern border of Missouri, this is the Missouri Compromise line we're talking about, okay? So everything north of that in that blue unorganized territory, that was going to have to be free from here on out. And the orange Arkansas territory was open to slavery. So the Compromise of 1820 is going to put off the Civil War a little longer. The next big issue is from 1850, okay? California in 1850 asked to become a state in the Union. They want to be free. That's what free soil means, okay? It was a term from that period. Free soil meant that you wanted to be close to slavery. One of the things that we're seeing in Congress as this compromise plays out is really a changing of the guard, okay? Some of the guys that we've talked about in the early part of the 19th century, this is really kind of the last big thing that they're going to be in on, okay? Henry Clay. Now remember, we talked about him with the Compromise of 1820. We talked about the election of 1824, other elections. This is the same guy. He's around forever, all right? We've got John C. Calhoun, who's part of this old guard. Okay, remember that vice president of Andrew Jackson, the nullification crisis. We also have another guy that we haven't spent a whole lot of time talking about who was very influential in the House of Representatives. His name was Daniel Webster. The new guard coming in are the form of guys like Stephen Douglas, who's a senator from Illinois. You're going to get to know him well in just one second, okay? And then you also have somebody like William Seward from New York, who ultimately has a pivotal role to play in Abraham Lincoln's administration. The Compromise of 1850, there are really 5 parts, okay? And how I have this divided for you, it comes straight out of your textbook. Basically, everybody got a little bit of what they wanted, okay? So the North gets what it wants. California is admitted as a state. Think about at this point, California basically goes from no white people to 200,000 in a 2-year period, and that is because of the gold rush, okay? Next thing that the North gets, there is some disputed territory between Texas and New Mexico. New Mexico gets to keep that territory. Why does the North like that? Because New Mexico is free. Texas is slave, okay? The third concession to the North is the abolition of the slave trade, but not slavery itself in Washington, D.C. Okay, so here's what that means. Basically, you could have slaves in Washington, D.C., but you weren't going to see open slave trading, slave markets, slave auctions happening in Washington, okay? If you were a Southern slave owner in D.C., you don't really care about this very much. All you have to do is go across the border a few minutes into Maryland, across the border a few minutes into Virginia, and you can still buy your slaves, okay? Let's go to the concessions to the South, okay? Remember this, the Mexican cession, okay, that's the territory that the United States got as a result of the Mexican-American War. That becomes the territories of New Mexico and Utah. Ultimately, other states are going to be carved from that territory. But it is ultimately decided that slavery there will be decided by popular sovereignty. That term is really important, okay? Popular sovereignty is code for the people get to vote. Most people understood that those places were going to be ultimately free, but the fact that the people got to vote made Southerners feel better than Congress passing a law saying that there was no slaves there, okay? Texas is compensated $10 million for giving up their claims to New Mexico. And then the last thing here, it's probably the most important other than California becoming a free state, and that is something called the Fugitive Slave Act, okay? The Fugitive Slave Act basically said, if you saw someone who you suspected of being a runaway slave, it was your responsibility, your job to turn them in. So if you were walking down the streets of Chicago, you saw an African-American man pass you, you thought, he could be a slave, you were supposed to turn him in, okay? Northerners did not like this because this is basically forcing them to participate in the system of slavery, and they don't like that. Does this go wrong and people kidnap African Americans to sell them into slavery? Absolutely. Okay, the movie 12 Years a Slave that came out last year, that's basically what it's about. All right, so here's a map that basically just goes through exactly what I told you. Okay, you can see California being admitted as a free state. In the purple, hopefully you'll notice the Utah territory and the New Mexico territory. Remember, those are open for popular sovereignty. That area in kind of this peachy color is still covered by the Missouri Compromise. Okay, now I'm going to give you a good introduction to Senator Stephen Douglas from Illinois, okay? He is very important. He is about to have some debates with Abraham Lincoln over that Illinois Senate seat. He is also going to run for president in the pivotal election of 1860. In 1854, he is a senator, and he wants to expand settlements into this territory in the West. Okay, we're mainly talking about territory that was a part of the Louisiana Purchase. Douglas has two reasons why he wants to do this. Number one, he had heavily invested in real estate. And essentially what he wants to do with that real estate is build a railroad from Chicago out into settlements in Kansas and Nebraska. He is hoping to make Chicago a center of commerce, a railroad hub, a real estate hub, okay? He can personally financially benefit from this. Second, and probably most important to us, Douglas wants to be president. And he is looking for a way to get Southern Democrats to vote for him. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go forward. The Kansas-Nebraska Act called for the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to settle their slavery status through popular sovereignty. So same thing with New Mexico and Utah. Douglas wants the people of Kansas and Nebraska to vote about whether to be free, whether to be slave. Why is that a problem? It's a problem because the Missouri Compromise says that they can't do this. They have to be free. So in order for this to work, the Missouri Compromise has to be repealed. Okay, this is just a little
Perhaps the
video
single
on a
most
novel
important
by a
cause of
woman
the
named
American
Harriet
Civil
Beecher
War was the
Stowe.
issue of
She
slavery.
published a book called Uncle Tom's
The North
Cabin
and
in
South held opposing
1852,
views on
and
slavery.
it was basically a
Many in the
novel
free
about a
northern
runaway
states wanted to
slave who
contain
gets
slavery and prevent
recaptured,
any
sold
new
back
states
into
from becoming
slavery, and
slave
it gives
states.
Northerners
But
a real
Southerners
idea of
felt
what
it
was
was
going
their
on in the South.
constitutional
So if you
right
guys
to
will
own
just click that
slaves.
video, it's really short. You can get an idea of what the book was about.
The Southern economy depended on slave labor to grow cotton, which it sold to textile mills in Britain and in the North. The cotton gin had led to the spread of cotton growing in the South and to the spread of slavery. Some Americans, the abolitionists, argued loudly that slavery should be ended. They made speeches and wrote articles and books saying that slavery was immoral. They denounced the Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed officials to arrest any African American suspected of being a runaway slave. The writer Harriet Beecher Stowe was the daughter of an abolitionist minister in Cincinnati, Ohio. Stowe lived along the Ohio River, a border between slavery in Kentucky and freedom in Ohio. She often visited plantations in Kentucky, and she grew deeply troubled by the miserable conditions in which slaves lived and the injustice of slavery itself. She witnessed the back-breaking labor of the slaves as well as the brutal way their owners treated them. Spurred to action, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel about a runaway slave who is eventually captured and sold back into slavery. Stowe depicted the cruelty of slave owners and the humanity of slaves. Many readers were stunned by the book's graphic descriptions of the harsh treatment of slaves. The book became an instant bestseller and highlighted the issue as a moral question of right versus wrong. Before Uncle Tom's Cabin was published, many Northerners had been unconcerned about slavery. But now many people viewed Stowe's book as evidence of slavery's immorality. Southerners called the book propaganda, claiming it did not describe slavery and slave owners fairly. They grew more suspicious of the North because they felt their rights and their way of life were under attack. Southerners wondered how their economy could survive without slaves, and why Northerners wanted to take away their rights. The tension between the two sections continued to grow, fed by fighting between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces in Kansas. The nation, it seemed, was heading toward war. In 1861, after the election of Abraham Lincoln, that war finally broke out. Several Southern states left the Union to create their own nation, and North and South formed armies that fought each other. Harriet Beecher Stowe's powerful book had played a part in readying people in the North for that war.
Okay, so once the Kansas-Nebraska Act goes into effect, sort of a scramble begins for how to make Kansas and Nebraska states and whether or not they're going to be free or slave. So if you guys will remember, you looked at the Northwest Ordinance. It provided a procedure for how to become a state. So in 1855, Kansas is going to hold an election for their first territorial legislature. Okay, here's what happens. People from Missouri come into Kansas and vote multiple times in a lot of cases. Why does this matter? This matters because people from Missouri are pro-slave. Much of the people who were from Kansas were free soilers. Okay, they wanted their state to be free. So obviously this whole thing is unfair. Ultimately what's going to happen is the state of Kansas is going to have two governments. They're going to have a pro-slavery government that sets itself up at Shawnee Mission. They're going to have a free soil government in Topeka. Okay. From there, it starts to get pretty ugly. In 1856, a gang of pro-slavery raiders attacked the free soil town of Lawrence. After that, a radical abolitionist named John Brown led a group of men in an attack at Potawatomi Creek. So basically, what's happening in Kansas is really just short of civil war at this point, okay? Because you've got free soilers attacking slaveholders and vice versa. In 1857, Kansas had enough people to apply for statehood. Remember that according to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, citizens were supposed to use popular sovereignty to decide this issue, okay? Here's another thing that's going to happen that's unfair. The Lecompton Constitution is created by pro-slavery politicians. And basically what it said is that voters couldn't vote for, against the Constitution as a whole, but they could only vote on the Constitution, on whether or not the Constitution would be with slavery or without slavery, okay? Even if the people of Kansas voted on this Constitution without slavery, they had written certain things in the document that would protect slave owners in Kansas. So again, we've got another moment here where this is basically unfair, okay? No matter what happened, this was set up so that Kansas would become a slave state. Ultimately, what a lot of the Free Soilers decide to do is to just not vote, okay? And of course what that means is all the pro-slavery people are going to vote for it, and it's going to get approved to include slavery, okay? They go back and forth over the next couple of years, but by 1861, when the Civil War begins, Kansas remained a territory, okay? They had not yet done what they needed to do to become a state because the pro-slave Free Soilers could not come to any kind of an agreement, okay? Why is all this important? President James Buchanan was in office at this point, okay? If you guys have noticed, nowhere in this lecture have I talked about the president at all. That's because the presidents during this time period are very weak, and they are very easily, I guess to use a modern word, bullied by people in Congress to do what Congress wants them to do, okay? President Buchanan basically ends up dividing the Democratic Party, okay? He basically makes the Douglas Democrats in the North angry. He makes the Southerners angry. When he does that, he divides the Democratic Party, okay? And that is a huge problem going into 1860, as you guys are going to see. All right, so here's one more big thing that we really have to do, and that is Dred Scott v. Sanford. This is a super important Supreme Court case. Hopefully by this point you guys know that if it's not important, I don't mention it to you, all right? So this is a really big one. Here's the background. Dred Scott was a slave. He sued his master for his freedom on the basis that he had been taken into a free state and a free territory. So his argument was, if I am taken into a free state, I automatically become free, okay? The Supreme Court's ruling here is really important. First and foremost, Dred Scott was a black slave. The Supreme Court rules that he is therefore not a citizen of the United States and has no legal standing in court. Think about that. We're going to have to go back in and fix this after the Civil War to include African Americans as citizens, okay? Here's the second part. Because the slave was private property, you could take that slave into any territory or state that you wanted, and legally that person was still held in slavery, okay? Here's how the Supreme Court views it. It's weird to us. But just because I drove my car into Alabama and Florida last week, that car did not stop being mine simply because I drove it over state lines. I know we're talking about a person, but the Supreme Court viewed slaves as property, okay? Lastly, they ruled the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. What that basically ruled is that Congress had no ability to ban slavery from any of the territories going forward. Okay, so the last thing that we need to talk about in this lesson is John Brown's raid. Okay, I want you guys to remember in the early 1830s, there was a black slave named Nat Turner who raided white families in Virginia. Okay, remember, this scared people in Virginia to death, okay, because their slaves grossly outnumbered them, and they realized that if their slaves decided that they wanted to murder the family in their beds, there wasn't a whole lot they could do to stop it, okay? So slaves really get clamped down on at that point. Nat Turner is executed. They want to make an example out of him, okay? John Brown, as we discussed earlier, was a radical abolitionist, okay? John Brown honestly believed that he had been sent by God to rid the country of slavery, okay? Here's his plan. He's going to invade the South. He ultimately does this at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is now located in West Virginia, okay? The plan was to raid a federal arsenal there, basically a huge warehouse of military guns. Those guns were going to be taken. They were going to be given to slaves who he thought would join him in droves. And then those slaves would use those weapons to overtake their masters, overtake their plantations. And then ultimately a black free state would be established. That's the plan, okay? It happens in October of 1859. Okay, so John Brown gets about 20 men. They were white and black. They go and seize this federal arsenal, or at least that's the plan, okay? What they don't realize is that a detachment of United States Marines, led by a captain named Robert E. Lee, come in and basically capture them while they're trying to raid this arsenal. In the course, 7 of John Brown's men are killed, another 10 are injured. What John Brown didn't count on is the fact that no slaves were going to show up to help them. He thought they would just all show up, they would get these weapons, they would overthrow their masters. That doesn't happen. Brown and his remaining men are captured by Robert E. Lee. And ultimately, Brown is tried and hanged for his actions. Okay, why? They want to make an example out of him. But ultimately, what he becomes is a martyr. Okay, like Jesus is kind of the original martyr. He becomes a symbol for the abolitionist movement, that they are willing to go to any cost to be able to rid the country of slavery. Okay. If you guys have any questions, please make sure that you ask me in class. This is super important, and I will see you next time.